If we really cared about it as a society, it wouldn't be happening. You know, if we really thought it was important, we would be all agitating for change, rather than just the few people who actually work in the industry, or, you know, the few people who've got relatives in there who've had bad experiences. You know, really, that's it. None of us care enough about it to do anything about it, is the bottom line. And so it's our responsibility. It's not, we can't point the finger at anyone except us. We're the ones who need to take responsibility for what's happening here. And we all need to step up.
I see a wanting to point the finger at residential aged care as though it was the only festering sore in the world, but actually in the world of older people, but it's not. And I think the other thing too that I see quite a lot is a pitching of old against young, and it's such cheap journalism. And, you know, it's blaming of older people for climate wars and young people not having houses and for the war in the Ukraine, and it just goes on and on and on. And it's such a cheap shot, but it fires people up every time, and it pitches old against young. And you've got to say in those situations whose interests are being served. And I think actually what happens is while we're trying to decide who's more at fault, older people or younger people, we're not fighting the real cause.
I think, you know, older people in Australia are neglected. Their needs are neglected. I think part of the problem is this narrative of the boomers, the baby boomers, or they've got it all. The baby boomers, they're the ones, you know, who have sucked up all the resources, leaving the younger generation with nothing. So that's that overriding narrative that's out there, and therefore, why should we care for them? But if you were to look at the figures of poverty, if you were to look at, you know, people who are homeless, those people who are on job seeker, you know, the biggest cohort on job seeker are people between the ages of 55 and 66, the boomer cohort. So I think, that I think allows the government to get away with poor policies, because they just feed off that narrative, so they don't have to do anything concrete. Yes. So yes, and the ageist narrative allows the government to get away with letting older people die before their time.
The fear of retribution within aged care is very real. You know, I think people have been reluctant. You know, I did talk about the grateful generation, and I think people are reluctant to complain, but I think also that people are fearful about retribution, and that's not without basis. And it'd be nice for things to be a little bit balanced too. You know, I think, you know, while I will absolutely you know, give Anne and the Four Corners credit for the story that you know, kicked the commission off. We need to hear some good stories, not just horrific stories about what happens in aged care.
But I think it also touched on something that the commission has touched on, is this unconscious ageist, you know, cultural trait that seems to permeate, you know, the national value set, or the national psyche, and perhaps a useful case in point, which is sad in itself, is that notwithstanding the media coverage that we saw with outbreaks in aged care homes in 2020 and 2021, we've had more deaths in aged care in the first 5 months of this year than what we saw in the previous 2 years to COVID. and yet it's almost the media is not interested. We're anaesthetised to this. This is just accepted now. It's COVID normal. And in a conversation I had with a journalist reflecting as to why this might be, it wasn't as blunt as this, but the inference was, well, it's old news and it's old people.
So that is, I guess, the underlying concern I have with some of these stories is it's hard once the story gets into the media for the aged care provider, because they're under confidentiality constraints as to what they can say about the care of individuals. It's hard for them to put up the alternative into the public arena about what might have been the circumstances of this particular situation. So does that mean the media have got it wrong in calling it out? Not necessarily, but it does mean that context is really important. And I think it's always important that we remember why these things in the broader picture might be happening. And that's to do with underfunding, undersupport, understaffing of aged care services, which are systemic problems. And they're the ones which, thankfully, the media did focus on through the Royal Commission and through the pandemic.
So it felt that the media was very interested in, and as they do, they look for conflict, and they look for who's the kind of the bad guy in the story. But they weren't really interested in covering the full breadth of the conversation. They had in my view, they had a particular narrative they were reporting, which was that providers are bad, and that's what they wanted to cover.